Today, we're going to talk about finding your superpower. And the reason I wanted Christian on with me is because I love to use analogies and characters and stories to help us, looking at you guys getting on, and stories to help us understand the trajectory of superheroes. There's lots of stories in literature, and we can use these things to help us understand our own superpower. What I want you to know first thing, hey guys, what I want you to know first thing is that a lot of times our superpower is something that we despise or that people fear about us, and that it takes a long time for us to embrace what we think is a painful thing about our lives as something that's really special about our lives. And I'll give you some client examples in a minute of how I've helped my clients understand that something they thought was awful was really awesome, and how I taught them to hone those superpowers, to actually use them for good, and to diminish the negative effects of them in their lives. Right? And I want you to know, and I'll say this at the end too, that I have a free worksheet. I have a free worksheet for you on finding your superpowers and honing them. Just go to controlthefuture.tech/super. So it's controlthefuture.tech/super. And I've got this really cool worksheet for you so you can just spend a little time, and it won't take you much time at all, to really figure out what your superpower is and figure out how to start honing it today. Okay.
The link for that is in the description.
Oh yeah, we did put that in the description because we're awesome some of the time.
I'm not.
Yeah, you are. But I'm your mom. So, Christian, let's talk about some superheroes and some of the storylines about superheroes. And a couple of things that I'm interested in finding out is when superheroes in certain stories actually start to discover that they have superpowers.
Can you go into more depth? Like what happens whenever they figure out they have superpowers?
No, like what age usually?
Well, it all depends on what type of superpowers we're talking about. If we're talking about like the Hulk, he got belted by gamma rays, turned into the Hulk. That whole song. So he got his superpowers whenever he was at an older age. If we're talking about Spider-Man, he was typically a teenager. Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about mutants from like X-Men and all that, mm-hmm. It was whenever they started hitting puberty. That's typically whenever it happened.
Yeah, I remember you dragging me to see X-Men, and I thought I wouldn't like it, and I loved it. So when we're talking about like humans, we could talk about mythology and gods and things like that too. But if we were talking about superheroes, let's talk about mutants for a minute. So why is it you think that they start becoming aware of their superpowers when they're adolescents?
Well, in the universe, it's whenever, in real life, whenever you are going through puberty, hormones start acting up and all that stuff, and things that weren't a problem before start becoming a problem. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where the thought comes from. Whenever these hormones are acting up, they activate your latent abilities. Mm-hmm.
It's when you're starting to come into your power and feeling confused about it. And that's what I want to say to all of you about your superpowers, is that you're going to reach a time in your life where you're really going to start to become more aware of them. And at that point, they can start to be problematic. Now, when I want to start by saying again that all of us have superpowers, all of us. And there are often things that we despise or that others despise in us. So let's talk a little bit more about how this works with superheroes. Many of us have things that are special gifts about us that others were afraid of, or that our parents rejected or said weren't normal, and they tried to make us change those things. Can you give any examples or think of anything off the top of your head of superheroes or people like mutants or things like that in stories, or even, I don't know, you know more about gods from studying mythology, but is there a time in their life when they're growing up where they really have a hard time with their powers because society rejects them or fears them for it?
That is a very regular thing that goes on. If you guys have ever heard of, if you've ever heard of John Constantine, there's a movie about him. He's a DC character. Forgot for a second. He has these pretty much psychic powers, and one big problem is because people just thought that he was insane during it. He got put into mental hospitals for most of his childhood and all these terrible, awful things. But it just kind of made him end up being stronger. Same thing with Spider-Man. When Spider-Man first started out, everyone thought that he was a villain, not a hero. And my favorite example is Hercules from Greek and Roman mythology. Everyone was afraid because there was this guy, just a random guy, who was super powerful and could kill someone with one punch, pretty much.
Thank you, Chris, for reminding me to smile. Okay, so let's talk about Spider-Man. Why did they think he was a villain?
Long story short, there were already super villains at this time, and they wore similar costumes and all this stuff. And there was also in the Spider-Man universe, this guy named James Jonah Jameson, really complicated name, who he ran a newspaper and labeled Spider-Man as a villain instead of a hero because he made a few mistakes whenever he started out.
Okay, and that's a good point that I really wanted to address. And that is when we start using our superpowers, we make mistakes with them. So there's this time where we have a superpower and then we start practicing it. So let's go back, and I want you to start thinking about what your superpower might be. And if you go to my website, controlthefuture.tech/super, I've got these questions for you to ask yourself. I've got these questions for you to ask yourself on what your superpower may be. And some of the questions are, is there something that you've really had a hard time with? In my life, one thing I really had a hard time with, because I'm a nurturer, and that is one of my superpowers, is being a nurturer, but I had a really super hard time with it because people took advantage of me. And I really didn't like that. I wanted to be stronger. So I want you to start thinking about the superpower that you have, if you haven't discovered it yet, is probably something that others told you shouldn't have, or rejected in you, or that you despised about yourself. I want you to start thinking about that. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when you start practicing your superpower and what that looks like. I always think about Star Wars, and Christian's like, I haven't even seen Star Wars.
I'm a nerd, but no, haven't watched it.
I always think about Star Wars, and so thinking about the Force and using good and evil and learning how to use the lightsaber and almost chopping people's heads off with the lightsaber. And so when you start using your superpower, whatever it is, you want to go out and practice it, and you're going to make mistakes.